Here we've got two different objects relating to a particular type of landing craft, the Landing Craft Infantry Small, or LCIS. This is part of a series of videos that we're doing for Heritage Open Days, where we're going behind the scenes, looking at some objects that aren't on display at the D-Day story. So these both relate to the Landing Craft Infantry Small, but two different examples of this landing craft. And this was looked a bit more like a ship than many landing craft. So it had a pointed bow, for example, whereas most landing craft have quite a sort of flat bow. And rather than having a single ramp, like many landing craft do, it had a ramp either side of the bow that it would let down that troops could go ashore using. And each one of these craft could carry about 100 men, so they were reasonably large in size. They're also known as the Fairmile Type H. And quite a lot of these craft were used on the British beaches on D-Day. The first object we've got here is a brass maker's plaque from LCIS 530. And this craft was built in 1943 at W. Weatherfield and Sons, which was a company near Edinburgh that before the Second World War had built fishing boats and yachts, but in wartime they built things like landing craft. And this particular plaque was removed from LCIS 530 towards the end of the war by Ron Twyford, who was one of the crew. We've got some photographs of Ron and other members of the crew. And we're fortunate that he did that, so to preserve the memory of that particular craft. Its role on D-Day, the role of LCIS 530, was to land men of 45 Royal Marine Commando on Sword Beach. So there were 5 of these craft in total that landed men of that commando. The commando's role was to then, once they'd landed, to march inland and reinforce the airborne troops. But they came under very heavy fire when they were landing. On several of the craft, there were quite heavy casualties amongst the crew and amongst the commandos. LCIS 530 seems to have escaped the worst of that. And so that was their experience on D-Day. The other object here is part of the hull. It's actually a section, a small section cut through the hull, all the different layers of the hull, of LCIS 506. That was actually done after the Second World War, when it became a houseboat. It was one of 3 of this type of craft that were at Bembridge on the Isle of Wight, converted for use of houseboats, and were there for many years. And this particular landing craft, LCIS 506, was built by Solent Shipyards at Burswood Bridge, so quite local to Portsmouth. But during wartime, and specifically on D-Day, 506's role was to land more Royal Marine Commandos on Sword Beach, but this time at the other end of Sword Beach, at the west end, and their role was going to be, once they got ashore, to march to the west and join up with Juno Beach. That was their specific role. And they also came under considerable enemy fire as they arrived. The reason this particular section was cut out, when it was, as I mentioned, when it was as a houseboat, was so that cables could pass through from the houseboat as it then was through to the shore. So even though we don't have an intact example of one of these landing craft surviving, we've got fortunate to have these 2 mementos to at least keep the memory of the craft alive. Visit our website at thedaystory.com to find out more about visiting the museum and also to find out about the various events that we run.